This video analyzes the game played between Chekhover, who played with the white pieces, and Rudakowski, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was D61. This opening is called the Queen's Gambit declined, classical variation with 7.QC2. Result: white won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4. This move, more than any other, offers chances of an opening advantage without taking risks. Two pieces are released at once, and a pawn occupies a central square, as with 1 times 10 to the power of 4th, but extra benefits accrue from 1.d4, the d-pawn is protected and safe from immediate attack. White is not exposed to the threats to his f2 pawn, which often arise in king's pawn openings. His control of c5 makes it impossible for black to develop his dark squared bishop at c5 to attack the vulnerable f2 pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d5, the simplest way to prevent white from dominating the center with 2.e4. Next move. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c4, the characteristic move of the Queen's Gambit. The versatile c-pawn does many things. 3 of 3 things are concerned with doing away with black's center. It offers itself in exchange, so that black may be lured into accepting a side pawn in return for his center pawn. It threatens, when the right moment comes, to destroy black's center by capturing the d-pawn. It exerts constant pressure on the d-pawn, so that black is kept occupied with its protection. Besides all this, the move of the c-pawn assures that the c-file is kept free and clear for the convenience of white's major pieces, while a pathway is opened for the queen, leading to the queen's side. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e6. Black strengthens the position of his center pawn. In the event that white plays 3 pawn from file c takes at d5, he is ready to recapture with a pawn and thus maintain a pawn in the center of the board. This is black's safest defense, even though it does limit the scope of his c8 bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f3. This is an excellent move, though not so sharp as 3. Knight moves to c3, which adds pressure to the attack on black's d-pawn. Either move complies with an injunction particularly applicable in queen's pawn openings: develop all the pieces as quickly as possible. The main principle in the openings, says Capablanca, is rapid and efficient development. The italics are his. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. Black's knight moves in toward the center, attacks the e4 square and adds its weight to the protection of d5. It is good policy to mobilize the kingside pieces first, since only two of them need be developed to make castling possible. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to g5, a powerful move. The bishop is developed and a restraining hand is put on the enemy knight. There is no immediate threat in the move, white just threatens to threaten. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to e7, the proper way to unpin a knight. The inexperienced player often grows impatient and drives the bishop off by 4. Black h6 5. Bishop moves to h4, g5 6. Bishop moves to g3 only to find that he has ruined the pawn position on the king side as a result of his violent action. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e3, white strengthens his pawn center and frees the light squared bishop for action. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king side. Black gets his king into safety before revealing his plans for the development of the queen side pieces. His b8 knight may go to d7, or following an attack on white's center, perhaps to c6. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c3. White has no such problems. His queen's knight can move to c3, since it does not obstruct the c-pawn and the opening of the c-file. At c3 the knight takes an active part in the struggle for control of the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight from file b moves to d7. This knight must never be developed at c6 before the c-pawn is moved. The pawn must be free, either to advance to c5 and fight for equal rights in the center, or to move one square to c6 where it bolsters black's own center. But the pawn must not be obstructed by black. Knight moves to c6. The development by 6 black and bd7 is stronger than appears at first glance. Black's position is cramped for the moment, but the knight is ready to support a liberating movement and an attack on white's center by black c5 or black e5. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c2, a magnificent square for white's queen. From c2, the queen exerts her powerful influence in several directions, on the partly open c-file and on the center, preventing black from freeing himself. By 7 black knight moves to e4. This attempt to force some exchanges and shake off the pressure is refuted by, after 7 black knight moves to e4, 8. Bishop takes at e7, queen takes at e7, 9. Pawn from file c takes at d5, knight takes at c3, if 9 black, pawn from file e takes at d5, then 10, knight takes at d5 wins on the spot, 10. Queen takes at c3, pawn from file e takes at d5, 11. Queen takes at c7, queen moves to b4, check. 12, queen moves to c3, and white has won a pawn. Another feature of 7. Queen moves to c2 is that it vacates d1 for the queen's rook, whose presence on the same file as black's queen will discourage the opponent from making a break in the center. Exchanges of pawns in the center would clear away some of the instructions and intensify the rook's pressure on the file, a pressure which reaches all the way up the file to the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c6. This move provides solid support to the center pawn and gives the queen access to the queen side. It looks substantial enough, but the more aggressive 7 black c5, disputing control of the center by establishing a state of tension there, might be more to the point. The danger in delaying black c5 is that black may never again have a favorable opportunity to get in this thrust. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d3. White develops a fifth piece, punting it at black's king side, and is ready to castle instantly on either wing. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file d takes at c4. Black waited for white to move his f1 bishop before making this capture. Otherwise, the bishop recaptures and develops at the same time. Black's intention, in clearing d5, is to swing his knight over to that square, force some exchanges, and free his cramped position. Nevertheless, black has surrendered the pawn center, which he so carefully built up. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at c4. White is content with the result of the pawn exchange. Lines are opened which increase the mobility of his pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to d5, obviously to compel white to exchange bishops. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at e7. This is safer than 10. Bishop moves to f4. Knight takes at f4. 11. Pawn from file e takes at f4, when white is left with an isolated d-pawn. The pawn itself is in no great danger, but the d5 square, directly in front of it, is. It is in danger of being occupied indefinitely by one of black's pieces. A piece stationed on a square in front of an isolated pawn can never be driven off by enemy pawns. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen takes at e7, the proper recapture, letting the queen come into play, taking with the knight would be developing backwards. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, castles on the king's side. The king finds a safer shelter while the rooks get in touch with each other. White's position is excellent, the result of simple straightforward development. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b5, this was a mistake. A better move would have been knight takes at c3, a shot at the bishop, to force its retreat. Meanwhile, black gains time for the development of his own bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e2, this was a mistake. A better move would have been knight takes at d5, the bishop withdraws but not to d3, where an attack by 12 black knight moves to b4 enables black to bring about an exchange of knight for bishop. White wants to preserve the bishop, which has excellent prospects for attack when it emerges later at d3 or f3. Editor's note: 12 knight takes at d5, pawn from file e takes at d5, 13 bishop moves to d3 wins an important pawn for nothing, brutal but effective. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to a6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight takes at c3, the usual maneuver of protecting the b-pawn, so that the c-pawn is free to attack white's center. If black can get in 13 black c5, he will still have a respectable game. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to e4, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight takes at d5, uncovering an attack. The queen threatens the c-pawn, while the knight restrains it from advancing to c5. White's idea is to prevent the indispensable freeing move black c5 forever and then barricade black completely by planting a piece at c5. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to f5, black protects the pawn by developing another piece. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to e5. Very fine strategy. Before settling a piece on c5, white plays to get rid of one of the guardians of that square. Black's knight at d7. If he plays 14, knight moves to c5 at once, then 14. Black knight takes at c5 15. Queen takes at c5. Queen takes at c5 16. Pawn from file d takes at c5 leaves him with a pawn occupying e5. This does not have the same effect as a piece standing on that square. A pawn is immobile and does little to restrain the opponent, but a piece radiates power in all directions and has a terribly cramping effect on the enemy's movements in the whole surrounding area. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file a moves to c8, developing another piece and defending the pawn which was attacked by two pieces. Black did not care for the exchange. 14. Black knight takes at e5 15. Pawn from file d takes at e5. White could then anchor his remaining knight at d6, follow up by planting his queen at c5, and throttle black thoroughly. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at d7, removing one of the pieces guarding the vital c5 square. Black. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen takes at d7 and luring the other one away. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c5. With the domination of this square, white's advantage is decisive in the strategic sense. What remains is to exploit his superior position, to translate it into actual victory, and this process of consummating the win is one of the most fascinating parts of chess. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c7. Both queen and bishop were attacked, so the queen stays near the bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file f moves to d1. The practice of the masters has shown that rooks are most efficient when they control open files. Suppose there are no open files. Then the rooks should be placed on partly open files, or on files likely to be opened. Suppose none of those seem to exist. Then the rooks should be brought to the center, to exert pressure on the center files. The rooks must be developed. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file c moves to d8. There are various reasons for this move, The rook has no future on the c-file while the pawn at c6 impedes its movements, and there is little prospect of the pawn coming to life. The rook vacates c8 for the bishop. The bishop cannot stay indefinitely at b7, where it is hampered by the c-pawn, and where the queen is tied down to its defense. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file A moves to c1. White's incidental threat of winning a pawn by 19. Knight takes at b7. Queen takes at b7. 20. Queen takes at c6 is subordinate to the strategic concept of intensifying the pressure on the c-file. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to c8. Black parries the threat of 19. Knight takes at b7 and frees his queen from the job of watching over the bishop. Now he can speculate on getting some counterplay by the break 19. Black e5. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e4. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to d3, magnificent centralization by the queen, who prevents 19. Black e5, when that pawn would be simply snapped up, and prepares to switch over for a kingside attack. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. The knight, best defender of the castled position, returns to f6, incidentally with an attack on the queen. Against other moves white could play 20. Bishop moves to d3, threatening 21. Queen takes at h7, checkmate. This would compel either a retreat by the knight or a weakening advance of one of black's kingside pawns. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to h4. The queen evades the knight's threat and swings over to the king side to get an attack rolling against the king. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a5. Black tries counter-attack on the queen side mostly to distract his opponent's attention. There is little he can do to strengthen the defense of his king side. Any move of a pawn only loosens the position and reduces his chances of resistance. The break in the center by 20. Black e5, which he contemplated making, is risky, to say the least, as 21. Queen moves to g3 in reply, pinning the pawn, is troublesome. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a3, the simplest way to save the a-pawn and to keep the queen from moving to b4. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b4, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to c7, hoping to disrupt white's queenside by continuing with 22. Black pawn from file b takes at a3. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a4. White avoids any exchanges that might let the queen set foot in his territory. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to d7, trying to shake off the grip of the knight, which is strangling his queenside to death. If he waits too long, white pursues his attack with 23. Bishop moves to d3, followed by 24. G4, to dislodge the knight which guards against mate. After the compulsory reply 24, black h6. White plays 25. G5, forcing an exchange of pawns which opens the g-file. White can then shift his king to h1 and swing a rook over to attack on the open file. Against this, black could not hold out very long. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to b3, this was a mistake. A better move would have been bishop moves to d3, defending the a-pawn, and so relieving the knight of that task. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at c5. There is hardly anything better. The tempting 23. Black e5 succumbs to 24. Knight takes at d7. Bishop takes at d7. 25. Rook moves to c5. Queen moves to c7. 26. Rook takes at e5, when white has won a pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at c5. The exchange of knights results in white substituting another piece at c5, maintaining his grip on the position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to b6, preferable to 24. Black queen moves to c7, when the attack might proceed thus, 25. Rdc1. Bishop moves to b7, to protect both the c-pawn and the a-pawn, 26. A5, to isolate the b-pawn by preventing 26. Black a5, and white follows up by 27. R1 c4 and 28. Rook takes at b4. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file d moves to c1, doubling rooks on an open file more than doubles the pressure on the file, and on the opponent. White's immediate threat is 26. Rook takes at c6. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b7. The bishop guards both light squared pawns, but its mobility is almost nil. The subject of mobility is interesting. While it is not always true that the player whose pieces have more room in which to maneuver enjoys an advantage, it applies often enough in practice for us to disregard the exceptional eases. It stands to reason that pieces that are free and untrammeled not only have more striking power in the portion of the board they occupy, but they also control and limit the activities of the enemy. Add to this the ease with which they can reach other parts of the board, and you can see the advantages to be derived from the ability to move freely about. Let us compare all the moves the pieces on each side can make. We are not evaluating their worth, whether good, bad, or indifferent. White's pieces are 250% as efficient as black's. With so great a disparity in mobility, and consequently in attacking force, how long can black continue the struggle? What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a5 in order to isolate black's b-pawn, and incidentally drive the queen back to the second rank. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a7 on the alternative 26. Black queen moves to c7. White can either resume operations on the king side or go after a pawn on the queen side by 27. Bishop moves to f3. Rook moves to d6. 28. r1 c4 followed by 29. Rook takes at b4. Winning the pawn will not diminish the force of White's attack or loosen his grip on the position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d3 now that the queen side is fixed. White turns his attention to the king side and threatens mate on the move. Black can easily dispose of this threat, but only by moving one of the pawns near his king and thereby creating a weakness which is organic, permanent, and irremediable. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to g6. If 27. Black h6, then 28. Queen moves to e4 forces 28. Black g6, when two pawns have been uprooted. White could then continue by 29. Rook moves to h5. King moves to g7, if 29. Black pawn from file g takes at h5, then 30. Queen moves to h7, checkmate, or if 29. Black king moves to h7, then 30. Queen moves to f4 wins, 30. Queen moves to e5, check. f6, or 30. Black king moves to h7, When the neat double pin 31 queen moves to g5 wins, 31. Queen moves to g3 g5, if 31 black f5, then 32 queen moves to e5, check. King moves to h7 33. Queen moves to c7, check. King moves to g8 34. Rook takes at h6 wins, 32. Rook takes at h6. King takes at h6 33. Queen moves to h3, check. King moves to g7 34. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. A simpler way, if white doesn't want to bother analyzing combinations, is to maintain the pressure and then apply more. For instance, after 27 black h6 28. Queen moves to e4 g6, instead of playing 29. Rook moves to h5, white could advance 29.h4, threatening to break up the pawns by 30.h5. If black replies 29 black h5 to stop the advance, white can either snap the h-pawn off with his rook or keep hammering away by 30.g4, pawn from file h takes at g4 31.h5. After the actual move, black has weaknesses on the dark squares and holes in his position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to f6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook from rank 1 moves to c4, the queen plants herself securely in one of the holes created by black's g6 advance. A hole is an unguarded square such as f6 or h6 brought into being by the advance of a nearby pawn. It is a weak square, because it is no longer under the surveillance of a pawn and is vulnerable to invasion by an enemy piece. Such a piece can settle itself comfortably in one of these holes, secure in the knowledge that no enemy pawn can disturb it. White's plan, now that the queen has worked her way into a dominating position on the king's side, is classical in its simplicity. He will just advance the h-pawn to h4, h5, and h6, and then play queen moves to g7, checkmate. If, after the pawn reaches h5, it is captured en passant, then mate by the rook is the instant punishment. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to d6, this was a mistake. A better move would have been queen moves to b8, black vacates d8, so that his queen can return to that square and challenge white's. In chess language, if 29.h4 queen moves to a8 30.h5 queen moves to d8. White's queen must leave f6 and forego the threat of mate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e7, this was a mistake. A better move would have been rook from rank 1 moves to c4, an attack on the exposed rook, so that black will have his hands full warding off the accumulating threats. Black has 3 problems, each on a different part of the board. 1. On the king's side, he must guard against being mated. 2. On the queen's side, he must release himself from white's stranglehold. 3. In the middle, he must rescue any pieces that are loose. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file f moves to d8, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to b8, if instead 29 black queen moves to b8, 30. Bishop moves to e4, rook moves to c8, 31. h4, queen moves to c7, 32. Queen moves to f6, queen moves to d8, 33. Queen takes at d8, check. Followed by either 34. Bishop takes at c6 or 34. r1 c4, with an easy, routine win. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h4. White is still aiming for mate by h5, h6, and queen moves to f6. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from rank 8 moves to d7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to b8, the queen must be evicted. Black does not play 30 black r6 d7 as he wants the first rank and the d8 square available to his own queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to f6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to e8 check, the danger of mate becomes more acute. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a8, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to d5, only by a retreat can black's queen rush to the rescue. If black tries 31, black rook moves to d5 to stop 32. h5. White affects the advance by first dislodging the rook with 32. Bishop moves to c4. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e4, not at once 32. h5 because of 32. Black queen moves to d8 in reply. After the text move, which incidentally prevents 32, black rook moves to d5, white can meet 32. Queen moves to d8 by exchanging queens and taking the c-pawn, winning easily if prosaically. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to e8 hoping to lure white into the premature 33. Bishop takes at c6, when 33, black bishop takes at c6, 34. Rook takes at c6, rook takes at c6, 35. Rook takes at c6, rook takes at d4 regains the pawn and gives him fighting chances. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook from rank 1 moves to c4, Each step the pawn makes increases the danger to black's king. The pawn is headed for h6, where it will settle itself firmly in the other hole in black's position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to d8. The rook withdraws, so that the c-pawn may have the added protection of the queen. The fact that black is kept busy warding off threats on both sides of the board is the clue to the next move, which presents black with an insoluble problem, the hardest kind to face. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at c6, removing a pawn that is apparently adequately protected. As will be seen, though, one of its defenders is overworked. The queen not only has to guard this point, c6, and the rook at d8, but must also keep an eye out for mate threats on the king. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at c6. Black must take the bishop or lose some material, since two pieces are attacked. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h6 as Zwischenzug, an in-between move, that threatens instant mate. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to f8, this was a mistake. A better move would have been queen moves to f8, on the alternative defense by 35. Black queen moves to f8, the win is forced with 36. Rook takes at c6, threatening 37. Rook takes at d6. Rook takes at d6 38. Rook moves to c8. Queen takes at c8 39. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. 36. Black queen takes at h6 37. Rook takes at d6. Rook takes at d6 38. Rook moves to c8, check. And black must give up his queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at c6. White has regained his piece and now threatens 37. Rook takes at d6. Rook takes at d6 38. Rook moves to c8. Queen takes at c8 39. Queen moves to h8, check. Winning the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook takes at c6. There is not much choice. If black plays 36, black queen moves to d7, to meet 37. Rook takes at d6 with 37. Black queen takes at d6, then 37. Rook moves to c7. Queen moves to e8 38. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at c6. White gets his rook back and prepares to seize the 7th rank by 38. Rook moves to c7. This would keep the king from escaping and again threaten him with mate by the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to d7, this was a blunder. A better move would have been queen takes at c6, there is no relief in 37. Black queen takes at c6, as white forces a winning ending by 38. Queen takes at d8, check. Queen moves to e8 39. Queen moves to d6, check. King moves to g8 40. Queen takes at a6. Queen moves to e7, otherwise 41. Queen moves to b7 wins at once, 41. Queen moves to b6 and the passed pawn cannot be slopped. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook moves to c8, this was a mistake. A better move would have been queen moves to g7 check, attacking the queen with his unprotected rook. A pretty enough conclusion, but pedants may point out that white missed a brilliancy in 38. Queen moves to g7, check. King moves to e7 39. Rook takes at e6, check. King takes at e6 40. Queen moves to e5, checkmate. Many a player has had quicker wins or more artistic ones than actually occurred pointed out to him by lesser lights, who revel in the fact that they found something the master overlooked. The reason the master didn't see the shorter line is that he was not looking for it in the first place. The move with which he wins is the one whose effects he foresaw earlier and analyzed thoroughly before starting his final combination. Once the series of forcing moves clicks, there is no reason at all for him to waste time finding other moves that might win. It takes time to analyze combinations, and the shorter way, ventured on hurriedly, might turn out to have a hole in it. The moral is, play the move that forces the win in the simplest way and leave the brilliancies to Alekhine and Kears. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen takes at c8 naturally, 38. Black rook moves to d8 39. Rook takes at d8 does not help matters. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to h8 check, 1-0 winning the queen and the game. Magnificent play by White, who never once relaxed his iron control of the game. A remarkable feature is the circumstance that none of Black's pieces or pawns, with the exception of the one brave little pawn at b4, ever crossed the 4th rank into White's side of the board.